In this video, I want to discuss the structures of the female reproductive system. And here we're going to start out with a three-dimensional model, and then we'll mid-sagittally section this model in just a second. First, I want to get the relationship of the different structures in the female pelvis. Here we have the pubic symphysis and the pubic bone, and immediately behind the pubic bone we have the urinary bladder of the female, the urinary bladder. Somewhat posterior and a little bit on top of the urinary bladder we will see the uterus, and then down below the vaginal canal, and then posterior to the uterus we can see the rectum. And here we can see the muscles of the urogenital diaphragm. Now on this model there are a few other things we can see that we can't see once we do the mid-sagittal section, so I want to do those first. If we look at the external female genitalia, we have the labia majora, and then medial to labia majora we will have labia minora. So the labia majora and the labia minora, and deep to the labia minora we have erectile tissue known as the bulb of the vestibule. So this area here is the bulb of the vestibule. Immediately posterior to the bulb of the vestibule we have a roughly pea-sized gland known as the greater vestibular gland. The greater vestibular gland makes vaginal secretions that are used during intercourse. So those are the structures we see. If we look at this in three-dimensionality, we can see a little bit of the clitoris right here, the glans clitoris. But if I remove this anterior portion of this model, now we can see in the mid-sagittal section essentially the same things. We can see the mons pubis, the fat which overlies the pubic symphysis. Immediately below the pubic symphysis we can see the glans clitoris. Now the clitoris is much larger than this. The portion that we typically refer to as the clitoris is only a small portion known as the glans. Here we can see the labia majora and the labia minora. We can see now a section through the urinary bladder and the female urethra. We can see the uterus with the uterine cavity and the vaginal canal. I want to take a few seconds to look at the structures here in this region before looking at other pelvic structures associated with the female cavity or female pelvis. Here we have the vaginal canal leading up to the uterus. Notice the uterus is not in line with the vaginal canal, but in the normal position is tilted forward over the top of the urinary bladder. But where the vaginal canal meets with the uterus, we have a little pocketing around the front, the back, and even the lateral sides. This is known as the anterior fornix of the vagina. This is known as the posterior fornix of the vagina. The distal end of the uterus is known as the cervical region. So from about here to here is the cervical region of the uterus. The external opening of that cervical region is called the external os. So here we have our external os. Then we go through the cervical canal to about here where we have our internal os of the cervical canal. Then the remainder of this is uterine cavity. Most of the uterus is made up of muscle known as the myometrium, and then on this model the darker purple color represents the lining of that uterine cavity known as the endometrium. Now all of this is covered over by a connective tissue sheet known as the broad ligament. The broad ligament. Now the broad ligament subdivides into different ligaments, but there are only two of those ligaments that I require my students to know on these models. One of those widens and goes forward and actually passes through the inguinal canal, just like the spermatic cord did in the male, and rather than then descending to the scrotum, will descend down to the labia majora. That is known as the ligamentum teres uteri, or the round ligament of the uterus. The other we see on this model in this darker blue color. This is known as the ovarian ligament. The ovarian ligament spans between the lateral aspect of the uterus out to the ovary. And we can see here the ovary, the gonad of the female. Associated with that ovary we can see the uterine tube. It used to be known as the fallopian tube. It is the uterine tube. and it is divided into an isthmus, the narrow part near the uterus. Then we travel out as the ampulla, then it widens as the infundibulum, and then it hangs down over the ovary as the fimbria. Those are the structures you should be able to find associated with the female reproductive system on this model.